7 or 8. There ought to be 12 up there. Isn't that where the jury sits or something? Now I'm getting worried. Good. A few more volunteer. The title I suggested a couple of months ago, Clinton's Vision, I didn't realize at the time how appropriate it would be and what an abundance of riches there would be to discuss it. The phrase power against the people was added later after the vision became manifested in action a little more. The word vision has become one of the most frequent words in the English language. I think it's incumbent on every journalist who's commenting on the administration and its activities to throw the word vision in at least 3 or 4 times, usually with the adjective grand or something in front of it. It's true that every president has to come along with a vision. That's part of the tools of the trade. But this one has really reached a peak of exuberance and exposure that goes a bit beyond the norm. Well, the vision was announced. There were 2 phases to it. There was an announcement and then the achievement to bring the announcement to reality. The announcement was in the last couple of days of September. There were 3 or 4 days there where there was a series of speeches by the President, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Ambassador to the UN, all of which presented the Clinton vision of foreign policy. And then in the following months, particularly in November, came the realization of the vision, both foreign and domestic, first with the passage of what is misleadingly called the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's not totally misleading. It does have to do with North America. So that version of NAFTA was the major achievement. That was followed immediately by an anti-crime bill and by the triumph at the Asian Pacific Summit out in Seattle. That's what I want to talk about, the vision, the announcement, the achievement, and I think the easiest way to do it is to kind of unravel it backwards. So let's start with the end, with the Asia-Pacific meeting in Seattle, where the vision was finally consummated. With great praise, I should say. There was much swooning over the grand vision, the greatest rethinking of U.S. policy toward Asia in half a century. Headlines like Clinton preaches open markets at summit, which was quite true. He did preach open markets at the summit. The performance came to its peak with a major speech that Clinton delivered, in which he spoke at a corporation in the buildings of a corporation which he designated as the model for his vision of the free market future for Asia. The corporation was the Boeing Corporation. He spoke in a hangar there and pointed out accurately that Boeing is the leading U.S. exporter. In fact, he could have gone on to say that civilian aircraft are the leading U.S. export manufactured item, $18 billion a year or 2 ago. He could have gone on to add further that the real U.S. comparative advantage in world trade these days is shifting from manufacturing to what are called services, and about a third of the export surplus is aircraft related, meaning tourism and that sort of thing. So it was a wise choice. That's the model that the free market vision for the future should copy. There are, of course, a few questions that could be raised. The idea of selecting Boeing aircraft as the model for a free market future does perhaps arouse a slight bit of puzzlement. Boeing, as is well known, is a publicly subsidized corporation. It is a private corporation, meaning the profit is private, but the public pays for it. Boeing wouldn't exist if it weren't for an enormous public subsidy that comes through the Pentagon and through NASA and so on. When you fly a Boeing airplane, as I did this morning, you're flying a modified bomber. The technology and the research and the development and the avionics and everything else were paid for by the public, including the Boeing workers. And if indeed civilian aircraft is our major manufacturing export, and if tourism-related services are our major service export, that simply shows how it's possible for a capitalist economy to survive if it completely abandons free market principles and rather relies upon extensive public subsidy in which public funds are provided to what's called private enterprise for them to use to maximize the profit of their investors and owners and CEOs and so on. That's the model for the future. Actually, for the free market future. If you look a little beyond into the small print in the laudatory articles, you'll find that the decision of the Boeing executives these days is to carry out what the press what the New York Times, I'm quoting, calls job-creating investment. So that's nice. You want to create jobs with the funds that you give them, except that those jobs are going to be created overseas because it's much more profitable that way. So the idea is that the Boeing executives make use of the public funds that are provided to them by their workforce and their communities and the rest of us in order to carry out job enhancement programs overseas because they make more profit that way. And as the Times put it, this is being done on a scale which would make the harshest critic of NAFTA wince if they knew about it. But fortunately, the people who are paying the bills, including the Boeing workers, aren't supposed to know about it unless they got to paragraph, 83 of the relevant article in the New York Times. Well, that's the model. That's the major model for the free market future for Asia. There was another one at the same time, also announced at the summit, and that was Cray supercomputers. Clinton announced that he had made a deal with China by which China would be provided with supercomputers from the Cray Corporation, and that's another model for the free market future that we're cheering about. Well, of course, Cray Supercomputers is another corporation that's publicly subsidized. Computers exist because of massive public funding directed through the Pentagon and the DOE and NASA from the very beginning in the 1950s when computers were not marketable, too big and clumsy. The public paid about close to 100% of the costs of research and development and provided a market for them, the state-guaranteed market that's the Pentagon's primary domestic function. As they got more profitable, the public share was cut back because then private corporations to whom these public resources were handed over were able to make money from them. In the 1980s, when there were new computer developments, expensive ones, fifth-generation computers and massively parallel computers and so on, the public share went up again. Things like Star Wars were primarily a cover for development of these new systems, then again handed over to private enterprise. And in fact, Star Wars was sold to the business community quite openly as a method of compelling the public to pay the research and development costs for the next generation of computers and lasers and fancy electronics and so on. And that, in fact, goes way back. Back in the late 1940s, the business press was calling for direct government intervention to enable U.S. advanced industry to survive, recognizing that it couldn't do it in any other way. And the Pentagon was selected pretty consciously as the optimal way of doing this from the point of view of corporate managers. The aeronautical industry is one of the main examples. with everything that came out of it, including fancy metallurgy and electronics and so on and so forth. So that's a kind of so the second model of the free market future that we are applauding is another major publicly funded institution handed over to private profit when its output becomes marketable, and now being offered to China. The offer to China is itself kind of interesting. China it was announced at the summit, simultaneously with the summit, that China would be provided not only with supercomputers but also with U.S. Products that can be used for nuclear power generation, generators for nuclear power plants from GE and so on, and also other high technology exports. These are being offered to China in violation of recent congressional legislation which bans export of high technology materials to China after Congress was informed by the intelligence system, apparently conclusively, that China was involved in proliferation of missiles in violation of international conventions and probably nuclear weapons proliferation as well. Well, according to the Clinton administration, the supercomputers are going to be used for weather forecasting. But Pentagon analysts quickly pointed out that nobody's going to know whether they're used for weather forecasting. The same computers can be used for missile development. The transfer of technology from nuclear power generation to nuclear weapons is a very small one. So there's a strong chance, in fact, a likelihood, that the Clinton administration is now engaged directly in technology transfer which will contribute to further nuclear proliferation and missile proliferation in violation of international conventions. And also, this, just as the choice of the Boeing Corporation and the Cray supercomputers illustrates the model for the free trade future that we're envisioning, similarly, these decisions to contribute to nuclear weapons and missile proliferation illustrate the second major plank of the Clinton vision, namely its opposition to proliferation. If you read the proper articles in the New York Times, elsewhere you'll discover that the Clinton vision for the future has three basic elements. One, the commitment to free trade. Two, the commitment to stop proliferation of missiles and nuclear weapons. And third, human rights. Well, the human rights component is illustrated by the first sale of high technology material to China after the Tiananmen Square massacre. At the same, just out of an intriguing conjunction, the very same articles that lauded these achievements, at the very bottom, they found a few lines with a little Reuters report noting that 81 people had just died in a factory fire in China where they had been locked in to keep them at work. This is one of the joint Hong Kong-China economic ventures, which is contributing to what's called an economic miracle in southeastern China. It's a fact that happened to be a factory that makes dolls, probably for sale to American children on Christmas presents, and we can only hope that they manage to get the dried blood washed off before they send them here. There was a series of other stories within the same days on other atrocities of a similar nature. So our commitment, let's say simply to summarize, our commitment to the free market is illustrated by the examples of our commitment to the free market vision of the future are state-subsidized, meaning publicly subsidized, private profit corporations, where the management, which of course has the right to do this in our system, carries out job enhancement programs elsewhere, dispersing public funds to eliminate the jobs of U.S. workers, because that's the way you can be more profitable.